right, we are starting a new section today. It's called Roots. So we're going to take a look at a nice big list of numbers here. So first we're going to take a look at a perfect square. And perfect squares are numbers whose square roots are whole numbers. So we can see right here along the side a square. To get a square, we're going to multiply a number by itself. So here is 1 squared, that's 1 times 1 is 1. So 1 is a perfect square. 2 squared, that's 2 times 2, that's 4. So 4 is a perfect square. 3 squared, that's 3 times 3, which is 9. 9 is a perfect square. So as you can see, we have a lot of perfect squares going down here. Be careful, remember exponents do not mean, it doesn't mean 3 times 2, it means 3 times itself 2 times. So I know 2 times 2 kind of looks like that's what I'm doing, but it's really just 2 times itself 2 times. So that exponent just tells me how many times to use the base. Okay, so we gave you a list here all the way down to 20 for the square roots. Very convenient list to keep with you while you're working on numbers, so you don't have to memorize all the perfect squares, but it's very nice to just have with you. All right, so square roots are kind of the opposite of a perfect square. When I'm asking you what a square root is, it is a number that is multiplied by itself. So a square root is the number that was multiplied by itself, right? Because a square is multiplied by itself, and the square root is the number that was multiplied by itself. Now that sounds funny. It's kind of like multiplication, division. We're going back and forth here a little bit. So with this one, if I wanted to know what is the square root of 1, I'd go back and say what number is multiplied by itself? 1. If I want to know what the square root of 4 is, I'd go back and say what number was multiplied by itself? 2. So this list can help me. If I want to know what the number squared is, it's on this side. If I want to know what the square root of the number is, I come back over here and see what number is being squared. That's the number, that's the square root. So with this one, I have 9 times 9 equals 81. So the square root of 81 is 9, because 9 was multiplied by itself. So I can even come back to the list here and go 9, square root, 81, silly me. 81, the square root is 9. And then when we're doing a fraction, you do the top and the bottom separately. So I have 2/3 times 2/3 equals 4/9. So this is squaring it. So the square root of 4/9, if I were to have a problem like that, I'd have the square root over the whole fraction, and I'm going to take the square root of 4 and the square root of 9. Don't do 4 divided by 9 and take the square root. That's not what Alex wants to see right now. Take the square root of the numerator and the denominator separately, unless you're very specifically instructed to give a decimal answer. So square root of 4, I can come back up here and go, it's 2. Square root of 9, that's 3. So it's going to be 2/3. And I know that was right here, so we could kind of see that at the beginning. Well, what happens if we have negatives in square roots? So we have negative 81, and we're taking the square root of that. So it looks a lot like this one. And the question is, can there be a negative square? And the answer right now is no. Because we can get 81 in 2 ways. We can do 9 times 9, and that gives us positive 81. Or negative 9 times negative 9, and that gets us positive 81 as well. So either way we get positive 81, not negative. So the square root of a negative number is not a real number. And that is the answer to the question, not a real number. Because we can't multiply the same number to get a negative. So it's either going to be 2 positives or 2 negatives. But we can't do like 9 times negative 9. That's not allowed. It's not the same number being squared, so that's not actually a square if you change one from positive to negative. So just be careful about that. If it starts this way, you can immediately say, not a real number. Okay? So there are real numbers, and then there are imaginary numbers. It'll be a few years before we start to learn about imaginary numbers. So for right now, the square root of a negative number is not possible. So just to kind of recap that, this is going to be possible later. There is a way to write this where it's not just not a real number. But for right now, that's all we're focused on. All right, so what is the value of the square root of 64? So we can go to that list that we had 2 pages ago here, and I can find 64 on the list, and I can go, well, the square root is 8, right? So, and I can write this out, 8 times 8 is 64. If I know what multiplies to get 64, it needs to be the same 2 numbers. So the square root of 64 is 8. I just I'm just taking which number it was multiplied by itself. Well, 8 was multiplied by itself. So it's 8. All right. So now we're going to come down here to 18 and 50. We're going to reduce first because that'll make it a little easier. So both of these numbers are even. They can divide by 2. 18 divided by 2 gives us 9, and 50 divided by 2 gives us 25. So now I can actually reduce this a little easier because 9 has a square root of 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. 25 has a square root of 5, because 5 times 5 is 25. So we can kind of see that here. Should have been clicking on it as I was doing it. So we can see the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 25 is 5. So the answer is 3/5. The 2's canceled. So if you didn't reduce the 2's first, you would have ended up with a square root 2 and a square root 2, which would have canceled at the end. So canceling at the beginning or at the end, it's not necessarily a big deal. Either way, you'll end up with 3/5. All right, so let's take a look over here. Evaluate the following, click on not a real number if applicable. So there's a little box off to the side on Alex that you can click on not a real number. You don't actually type that in. You would click on the button to fill it in. So we have a square root of a negative number. So remember, it's negative under the square root sign, so it's immediately not a real number. Because to get 49, I'd either do positive 7 times positive 7 or negative 7 times negative 7. But either way, I would end up with positive 49, not negative. So that's not real. All right, so we can move here. If there's a negative outside of the square root sign, that's fine. We're going to take the square root of this number and then put the negative on it because it's outside of the square root. So it's not being affected by this square root sign. So if we look at that list, we'll see that the square root of 121 is 11 because 11 times 11 gives us 121. So the square root of 121 is 11. And then we just need to make sure there's a negative in front, so we just kind of tack the negative on there. Let's see, I think that's it for the square roots section. So I will see you in the next video.